Today I'd like to talk about some important genetics terms that we will be using throughout our genetics study. Right now they might seem like a foreign language, terms like allele, dominant, recessive, heterozygous, homozygous, genotype, and phenotype. But trust me in knowing that these terms will become second nature to you very quickly over the next few days as we work with our genetics problems. We are going to start with what I'll refer to as simple genetics. And what that means is you get one allele from each parent and the trait is coded for by two alleles. So our first term is allele. An allele is part of a gene that codes for a trait. You get one from each parent. In our genetics problems that we'll be doing, they will be represented by a letter. Now, our genetic information is all in the form of DNA, and that DNA is all coiled up into chromosomes. Humans have 46 chromosomes. You get 23 chromosomes from one parent and 23 chromosomes from the other parent. You can think of an allele as a small little section on one of those chromosomes, or a section of DNA that codes for a particular trait. You'll get the one allele of information from one parent, the other allele of information from the other parent, and put together, those two alleles will code for a trait in the offspring. Now, along with that simple genetics that I referred to, we will also be assuming that one allele is dominant and one allele is recessive. There are many more complex ways things are inherited than this simple genetics that we'll start with, and we'll explore those as well. But this is a nice place to start, where a trait is inherited by two alleles, one from each parent, and one is dominant and one is recessive. So dominant is our next term. I'd like you to write, if this allele is present, it covers up the recessive. So if the dominant allele is present from one parent, even if the other parent gives the recessive allele, the dominant trait is what will show up. A couple of the traits we discussed in class, like cleft chin and widow's peak, are run by something along these lines of dominant and recessive. And if you have the dominant allele for widow's peak, for example, even though the other parent may have given you the recessive allele not to have widow's peak, you would end up with widow's peak. Recessive, on the other hand, this allele gets masked or covered up if the dominant allele is present. So if one parent gives a recessive allele, if the other parent gives a dominant allele, then the dominant trait will show up. If, however, each parent gives a recessive allele, that's when the recessive trait would show up. I'm going to go through an example with just an imaginary mythical creature, just to kind of walk us through what some of these terms look like. So let's talk about unicorns. And in unicorns, their main color could be rainbow colored or pink. And let's say that it is dominant to have rainbow colored hair over pink hair. So rainbow color is dominant to pink. Now, as I mentioned when I was defining allele, when we do genetics practice problems, alleles will be represented by a letter. And how we decide those letters is we take a look at the dominant trait, which the dominant trait here we said was rainbow color, and we choose a letter that represents that. So rainbow, we could go with R. And a capital R will represent the dominant trait. So capital R equals rainbow. Now it would make sense for the recessive allele, in this case, to be maybe a letter P for pink, but that is not what happens. The poor little recessive allele is not even cool enough to get its own letter. What it gets instead is the lowercase letter of the dominant trait. So for pink, the allele for pink will be little r. Okay, now let's go back to our terms for a minute. The next term is heterozygous. Heterozygous means there are two different alleles for a trait. So when you get one from each parent, those two alleles would be different from each other. Whereas homozygous means you get two same alleles for a trait. So let's go back to our unicorns. And if I had, remember you get one allele for each trait, and the trait is coded by those two alleles. So let's say I have an offspring that is big R, little r. They would be heterozygous because their two alleles are different. One's dominant and one's recessive. You could also get a big R from one parent and a big R from another parent. This would be homozygous for the trait because both of their alleles are the same. Lastly, you could get one little r from one parent and one little r from the other parent, and that would also be homozygous for the trait because both of those letters are the same. Okay, last two terms are genotype. Genotype is the genetic makeup of the trait, or the letters, as we will refer to them in our practice problems. So anytime I ask you for the genotype of an offspring or a parent, you will be telling me what two letters they are. Whereas phenotype is what physical characteristic of the trait shows up in the offspring. So this is what you will actually see. So in our case with the unicorns, a phenotype would be rainbow hair or pink hair. So let's go back and take a look at that. I'm going to clear off some of this space for a minute. So we have our options were big R, big R, big R, little r, or little r, little r. These three things are our genotypes. They are the genetic makeup of what we get. Whereas big R, now we know that rainbow hair is dominant. So big R is going to produce rainbow hair. Big R will also produce rainbow hair because if the dominant allele is present, it will show up in the offspring. And little r, our two recessive alleles, will produce pink hair. So these are what we would call our phenotypes, what actually shows up in the offspring, of which there are really only two. It could be either rainbow-haired or pink-haired. The last thing that I want to show you is just an introduction to something called Punnett squares. And what Punnett squares will do for us is show us the possibilities when there is a crossing of two parents. What are the possibilities for their offspring for any given trait? So let's continue with our unicorn. And a Punnett square is a really simple structure. This is what it looks like. And we would put one parent across the top here with their two alleles, and we would put the other parent along the side here with their two alleles. So let's say that you have a unicorn that is rainbow-haired and is heterozygous for the trait. What would their genotype be? Rainbow-haired and heterozygous, meaning different alleles. Their genotype would be big R, little r. And you would write those in these two spots, meaning that particular parent could give their big R allele, or they could give their little r allele to any given offspring. Now let's say that unicorn is crossed with a unicorn who has pink hair. If the unicorn has pink hair, we should automatically know their genotype. What would a pink-haired unicorn's genotype be? It would be little r, little r. And we know that because pink hair is recessive, and the only way for the recessive trait to show up would be if you have both recessive alleles. So now to do a Punnett square, what we're looking at is in this box here, if this is one possibility, where this parent could give this allele, and the big letter always goes first, and this parent could give this allele. Move down to this box here. This parent would be giving this allele, and this parent would give this little r. Over into the top corner here, we'd get a little r from this parent, and this little r allele here. And lastly down here, little r and little r. And what you can see now is this would produce, a big R, little r would produce a rainbow-haired unicorn. Rainbow-haired unicorn. These two would produce pink-haired unicorns. So we have 50% rainbow and 50% pink. Now people have a tendency to look at Punnett squares and imagine that every time two parents crossing, they're going to have 4 offspring and they will have one of each of these 4 boxes. And that's not what this is intended to show. What this shows you is that each time or any time these two parents are crossed, they have these 4 chances or options in terms of what trait mix-up will happen. It's probability, much like what you've been working on in math. All right, the last thing that I want to show you is something that you might be familiar with in eye color. Now, eye color is pretty complex genetically. It is not a simple genetics scenario like I've been talking about. But there is one simple genetics piece to it, and that is that brown eyes are dominant to blue eyes. So if we were to establish our alleles or letters with brown being dominant, I would write big B equaling brown, and then little b would equal blue. And my question is it possible for 2 brown-eyed parents to produce a blue-eyed offspring? And the answer is yes. They would have to both be heterozygous parents. And let me show you that cross. So a brown-eyed parent who is heterozygous would be big B, little b. They phenotype-wise would show brown eyes because this is dominant and it's going to show up. If they are crossed with another parent who is brown-eyed and heterozygous, let's see what our Punnett square produces. In this corner we'd have big B. Down here, big B, little b. Over here, big B, little b. And over here, little b, little b. So 1 out of every 4 times, or a 25% chance of producing a blue-eyed offspring. Now, it would not work if either of these parents were homozygous for their brown eyes. And let me just show you that quickly so you can see that that's true. If we had one who was heterozygous brown-eyed, but the other one had brown eyes and was homozygous for the trait, you would always have a big B in play and produce 100% brown-eyed children. All right, last question. Is it possible for 2 blue-eyed parents to produce a brown-eyed offspring? And the answer to that question is no. So if you drew a Punnett square here, and I'm going to cross a blue-eyed parent, which their 2 recessive alleles would produce blue, so they're little b, crossed with another blue-eyed parent who would have to be little b. As you can start to see, 2 blue-eyed parents would produce 100% blue-eyed offspring. Now, there could be some variation in greens and those kinds of things due to a lot of other complex genetics involved with eye color, but they could not produce a brown-eyed child.